The Middle East is once again what everyone is talking about, and as if time did not move on, Israel is once again at the epicenter of the conflict. Luckily for Israel, this is not like those wars of the 1960s and 1970s, where several Arab countries suddenly attacked Israel. For the moment, it is more reminiscent of the wars Israel waged against Lebanon in 1982 and 2006, in an attempt to wipe out the Palestine Liberation Organization and Hezbollah respectively.
Iran's warning to the UN: if Israel invades Gaza, we will intervene. We have our finger on the trigger.
Indeed, Iran has already sent some warnings about a possible war with Israel, and this is not a minor thing. Iran is one of the three major regional powers in the Middle East along with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it has a considerable military capability. And analysts are already warning of a possibility that if Iran were to go to war with Israel, the United States would most certainly be drawn into the conflict. This could be an introduction to a much larger conflict. What have relations between Iran and the United States been like? Why is the US so concerned about a possible Iranian intervention in Israel? Would the US actually attack the Islamic Republic? Iran and the United States despising each other is nothing new, it has been the case for several decades. However, it wasn't all the time. In fact, there was a time when they actually were good with each other. Nevertheless, everything changed with the Islamic Revolution of 1979. 10 years after Iran became independent in 1943, the United States began to move closer to Iran and overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. After he nationalized the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, from that moment Shah Reza Pahlavi, wildly unpopular among the Iranian population but with strong support from the US, came to power. It was then that the friendship between Iran and the United States began to blossom. For instance, in 1954, the Shah granted a 25-year permit to U.S. oil companies to exploit some of the nationalized oil. Later in 1957, the two signed a nuclear cooperation agreement that became the basis for Iran's nuclear program and enabled it to obtain its first nuclear reactor in 1967, and not only that, in 1972, during a visit by former President Richard Nixon to the Shah, the United States promised to allow Iran to purchase non-nuclear weapon systems if it would commit to protecting U.S. interest against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. However, 1979 came along, and the Islamic Revolution turned this amazing friendship upside down. Ayatollah Khamenei came to power, Iran became an Islamic republic, and the United States became its main enemy along with Israel. From then on, their relationship went downhill and without any breaks. For example, in the first 2 years of the Islamic regime, between 1979 and 1981, the United States had to deal with the American hostage crisis in Iran. Later, the U.S. supported Iraq in the war that Saddam Hussein unleashed against the Ayatollah's regime between 1980 and 1988. In the meantime, the United States did not hesitate imposing sanctions on Iran. And in 2002, shortly after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, former President Bush included Iran along with Iraq and North Korea in what he called the axis of evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Obviously, relations went from bad to worse. There was, however, a moment of calm in all this tension. In 2015, 10 years after Iran's clandestine nuclear program was discovered, the United States, the Islamic Republic and other European countries signed the famous Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. A plan that limited the nuclear capability Iran could develop and subjected it to strict monitoring, a plan that fell apart just a few years later. So, in general, the relationship between Iran and the United States over the last 4 decades has been fraught with tension. If you wake to reality, that hostilities have never ceased. In fact, these last few years have made the situation even worse. Many would have thought back in 2018 that Iran and the United States at least have entered a space of calm with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. However, if the world has shown anything in recent years, it is that we cannot take anything for granted, and that is exactly what happened with the apparent calm between the United States and Iran, which ended up blowing up.
Trump abandons Iran nuclear deal he long scorned.
Yes, Trump abandoned the program that had created some peace between the United States and Iran. The US was quick to impose tough new sanctions on the regime, hoping that Iran would halt its nuclear program. But Iran basically stopped complying with the agreement altogether. The land of the Ayatollah intensified uranium enrichment to such an extent that in 2019, the International Atomic Energy Agency warned that Iran had already reached 84% enrichment. A nuclear weapon needs 90% enrichment uranium. In other words, in 2019 they were already on the verge of achieving it.
We no longer have a safety distance of a year breakthrough to going nuclear. Iran is 2 weeks from breakthrough, one step away from arriving at 90% enriched uranium, a sufficient amount of enriched uranium, a sufficient amount for a bomb. In order to transform the bomb into a weapon, and complete its adaptation to a missile warhead for a missile, about 2 more years are needed.
Faced with this, the Biden administration, which tried to resume negotiations with Iran on the nuclear deal, has continued with sanctions against the Iranian regime, attempting to isolate it further internationally. Yet, this has only ended up reinforcing friendships that the states would prefer to weaken, such as Iran's friendship with Russia. Although Iran would have preferred closer ties with China, international sanctions have proved to be an uncomfortable obstacle to its relations, as China does not want to risk losing the huge trade it shares with Western countries. For that reason, Iran has opted to strengthen ties with Russia, another international pariah, also hit with a slew of sanctions. Initially, cooperation between these two countries was primarily in the energy field. However, Russia's war with Ukraine has expanded this cooperation to other strategic fields.
Ukraine war, US says Iran now Russia's top military backer.
Since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Iran has been able to send, according to Ukrainian government sources, about 2,400 drones to Russia. We are speaking about the kamikaze drone models, Shahed 131 and 136, which greatly assist Russian efforts in Ukraine, particularly due to their value for money. It should be noted that while each of these drones cost around $2,000 to produce, shooting them down costs Ukraine on average between $14,000 and $15,000. For this reason, both Iran and Russia have committed to building a drone factory inside Russia. Iran is being very helpful to Russia, but what does Iran get out of its rapprochement with Russia? This move by the Iranian regime is more of a long-term investment in Russian power. Iran is going to receive advanced fighter helicopters and anti-aircraft defense systems. It is also interested in learning how to circumvent Western sanctions, as Russia has done. But above all, Iran is looking to Russia for protection in international organizations, and more specifically protection from the United States and the European Union. The greatest concern of the US government, given the circumstances in the Middle East and Israel, is neither Iran's nuclear program nor its friendship with Russia, but the allies Iran has within the region. When Iran wants to attack a country, it does not do so directly but through terrorist groups that it finances heavily. The best example of this is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Lebanese terrorist group, a political party that emerged during the country's civil war between 1975 and 1990. Which receives both thousands of missiles and hundreds of millions of dollars every year from Iran. Hezbollah has become Iran's most important ally in the Middle East, as it controls almost every aspect of Lebanon, a country bordering Israel. This organization has already had a lot of run-ins with Israel in recent times.
Northern border heats up with fresh rocket fire, Hezbollah attacks on IDF posts.
Hezbollah has not dared to attack Israel on a large scale nor to declare war on it. However, the main player of the new conflict with Israel, Hamas, also has strong ties with Iran. Iran is not close to Hamas as it is to Hezbollah, but even so their cooperation dates back to the 1990s, at which time the Islamic Republic began funding the Palestinian terrorist group with more than $50 million annually, and weapons that it has been sending through Hezbollah. In 2012, Hamas began bombarding Tel Aviv with Iranian long-range Far-5 missiles. Given the circumstances, many now believe that Iran was behind the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on 7th of October. There are certain voices that truly believe that Iran was behind the attacks against Israel at the beginning of October. The Israeli government also strongly believes it, and the truth is that everything points to this being the case. Even so, in Washington, they claim that there is still not solid evidence to confirm Iranian involvement in the Hamas terrorist attack. But whether Iran had anything to do with it or not, what it has made clear is that should the Israeli response against Hamas in Gaza continue, Iran would not hesitate to intervene and start an open conflict against Israel. This would lead to the US joining the conflict on Israel's behalf directly. But why? How important is Israel to the United States? In addition to being one of its best allies, Israel has been of crucial strategic importance to the United States since 1967 in the Cold War. It served as a kind of dike of containment, a forward base against Soviet influence in the Middle East. And today, to a certain extent, it is a buffer against Islamic radicalism and the powers that seek to undermine US's interests. Israel shares its experience, intelligence, information, and if necessary it has a whole Spartan force prepared for any contingency. That is why their economic, military, and technological cooperation has been so intense. There is little doubt that if Iran were to attack Israel, the United States would intervene in the conflict. In recent years, when Israel has clashed with Iran, the response has been directly Israeli and it has been forceful.
Israel launches massive military strike against Iranian targets in Syria.
Now there is another totally determining factor that has set the US and the entire Middle East on edge, possibly a nuclear Iran. Experts indicate that Iran may already have enough 90% enriched uranium in its possession. They claim that it would still take between 6 and 24 months to develop a nuclear weapon. But even if US intelligence assures us that Iran did not reopen its nuclear weapons development program in 2022, the reality is that we cannot be entirely sure whether Iran already has a nuclear weapon. One thing we need to have in mind is, since the US withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, Iranian transparency on nuclear matters has been almost nil, and not only that, we must also remember that the assembly of a nuclear weapon can be done perfectly well underground, thereby rendering satellite analysis is useless. Obviously, as you can imagine, Israel is particularly fearful of this situation, which could represent the main existential threat to the country by far. In fact, that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu already stated this just a few months ago.
How do you stop a rogue nation from acquiring nuclear weapons? You had one that is called Saddam Hussein, Iraq. It was stopped by military force, ours. You had a second one that is called Syria that tried to develop nuclear weapons. And it was stopped by a military action, ours.
The truth is that the Iranian issue is getting red hot. The seizure of oil tankers, its support for Russia, its participation in the attack on Israel, and a possible nuclear bomb, there are more than enough reasons for things to escalate. Indeed, many analysts are already considering the possibility of US intervention, if violence escalates in the region. But would its intervention in Iran be successful? The Biden administration has already decided to prepare for a possible conflict.
US to send second aircraft carriers to Eastern Mediterranean. USS Eisenhower will join the USS Ford off of Israel.
In the event of wanting to attack Iran, the US would most likely need much more than 2 aircraft carriers, but there are plenty of US equipment in the region, including a huge air force in Qatar. And we have to take into account that Iran has the largest arsenals of both long-range ballistic missiles and drones in the Middle East. Its armed forces are among the 20 most powerful in the world, surpassing even that of Israel in some metrics. The US is deploying a large naval force in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. They clearly anticipate a lot of trouble in this region. This is possibly the largest naval deployment the US has ever done in the past several decades. It's deploying 2 aircraft carriers, strike groups, 11 Burke-class destroyers, a large number of cruisers. There are amphibious assault ships and THAAD missile defense systems that have been deployed in the region. Even Patriot missile defense systems, multiple squadrons of fighter jets, strategic bombers, and there are an unknown number of submarines. Obviously, it is going to accompany the surface assets of the US Navy, and there are other undisclosed assets as well, and there are naval assets that belong not just to the US, but to a large number of nations, which include Indonesia and Bangladesh. So there is this multinational naval force led by the US, that is being assembled in the eastern Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Israel. So, this is not just the matter of safeguarding Israel but a much larger thing. It's almost like an invasion force, which kind of reminds of the kind of force the US had assembled in the Persian Gulf region before the 1991 invasion of Iraq. However, the US would have to be very careful because there is a very high possibility that the costs of the potential intervention would far outweigh the benefits. If the United States had to intervene, both Iran and its allies such as Hezbollah would not hesitate to attack quickly and directly both the US bases in the region and Israel, but not only that, there would also be the risk that Iran would completely close the Strait of Hormuz, causing quite possibly another serious energy and economic crisis worldwide.